this goes. Let's make this not full screen. I'm also adding this little bit down here so that way you can see what keys I'm pressing. I'm hoping that'll help. That's an add-on called Screencast Keys, and it should prove useful. So paying attention to where the x-axis is and the y-axis, I'm just going to take this basic cube, I'm going to subsurf it. Subsurf it like maybe 3 times, and then hit apply. I'm going to scale that up. And I'm going to hit Control A and apply that visual transform. I'm going to head into sculpt mode, then topo. And what I'm building here, you would normally want to retopologize with a mesh that is a little bit more appropriate for animation. But to get us started, you can build something like this that's pretty simple. I'm going to try to keep my vertices and so forth under 50,000 or maybe under 100,000. Once they start getting up into the millions, your machine will start to get really slow. So you want to keep it simple. I'm scale up my brush. I'm mirroring on the x-axis, so I'm just going to grab the snake hook guy and just pull out some simple legs. So, like that. And then maybe some basic arms. Oh, they're like wings. Let's pull these out. And if you have a Wacom tablet, I encourage you to explore sculpting with a Wacom tablet because it's pressure sensitive and you can do some really interesting things with it. Let's use inflate, and let's just sculpt out a head. Just a bulbous head. And the rig that I'm building is going to be super simple. If you look at more advanced rigs, like with the canned rigs that come with Blender, they can become a lot more sophisticated. But for doing this kind of basic animation, I think it's better to start with a basic rig so that way you get an idea of what the more complicated rigs are doing down the road. You can make this more sophisticated, but I wouldn't do it with your first try. This is something that you should plan on taking several attempts before you get it just right, and plan on having lots of fits and starts. So basic head, basic body, basic arms. He's pretty boring, but I think that's going to work out well for us. Let's move this over. Good. All right, step back into object mode. I'm going to hit Shift S to snap the cursor to the selection here. I'm going to start adding a bone system. Shift A, armature, single bone. So there's a bone in there, but we can't see it, and it's currently selected. If I look over in the project outliner over here, you can see that the armature is selected. So over here in the armature settings, right here, we can turn on X-ray. And now we see the bone no matter where it is. And what we'd like to do is just build out a really basic skeleton for this guy. This will be part of his spine. I want to make sure it's in the center. And if it helps, you can split your view. And T and N to turn off the shortcuts there, or the toolboxes, T and N. And let's have this view be orthographic. And let's look straight on through the front view. There we go. And then this view can be where I roll around and see the different parts. I'm going to step into edit mode on this armature. And then I'm going to extend out the bone on the Z axis. So again, hit E, Z, and then pull that down. Now by default, this bone might not be connected to this bone. And so we want to make sure that it is in fact connected. So you can see there it's not. And so we want to parent this bone to this bone. So I'm going to select this bone, then shift right click and hit Control P, and we're going to make those connected. But better yet, Control P, and we're going to keep the offset. So in that way, you can see this line here that they are connected. So when we move into pose mode, the bones will be connected. Then what I'd also like to do is extend out hip bones. I'm going to hit the little plus sign here, go to Options, and turn on X-axis mirror. And then hit and turn off the tools. And so I'd like to extend out on the hip, on the X-axis. So I'm going to hit Shift E for extend. And when I hit Shift E instead of just E, it moves out in two different directions if X-axis mirror is turned on. And so then I hit X so I can move it out on the X-axis. It's not terribly necessary that you make sure that it's lined up to the X-axis here. And then I'm going to hit E again and extend out some leg bones. Do the same up here. Shift E, move out some collar bones. E and E. You can add more or less bones here if you want. I think I'll just work with this many, and you can adjust it as needed. Notice as I make adjustments with X-axis mirror turned on, it stays on both sides. You can make a bipedal character. You can make a quadruped. You can make an octopus. I would keep it really, really simple at first, though. What you cannot do is make a character that flies. You cannot make a ghost. So there's no shortcuts there. I want you to make a walking cycle, because the process of keyframing this and setting it up is a critical one for this learning that we're trying to get across here. So I'm making sure that the bones are in fact in the middle of each appendage as best as I can get there. If you wanted to set it up in another body, where if you place the bones where they would be if they were a skeleton, if you make a more skinny character and so forth, you would actually line these up if you want it to be humanoid, where the actual bones are. So a lot of artists who do this, they're very familiar with anatomy, and even in the most contemporary of animations, they don't just build a skeletal system like this, they also build a muscle system, and that muscle system is simulated underneath the mesh. And so you'll see that a lot more in hyper-real simulations. E, Z, send that up. I'm going to look over at the side here. Side. There we are. Let's make a head bone. If you want to make a neck bone, you can. I'm just going to have a really simple head bob. So E, let's pull that out. Yeah. Making sure that it is aligned and straight. Yeah. Okay. What I'd also like this guy to have is feet, because I'd like a critical aspect to making the walking cycle is that the feet go on the ground and they stop at the ground. And one thing that's going to throw you off is if you don't have a floor on which to walk. And so that's what I'm going to do next, is make some feet. So if I select this knob down here, or joint, and hit E and then Y to drag out some feet. We won't see these bones, of course, but they give us something to actually touch the floor on. But it's a weird thing that we have to set up here, because right now these feet are actually connected to the legs. And in order for this to actually work properly, we don't want these feet to actually be connected to the skeleton system in a direct way. So what we have to do is clear the parenting. And so right now what we want to do is, let's see here, if I select this one and then select this one, and then I hit Alt-P, we can clear the parent. And so our goal here is that this bone actually be disconnected, like this. And notice it did it on both sides. So after we've got this basic armature set up like this, what we can do is start setting up our inverse kinematics so that when we move bones, they actually start to move the actual whole skeleton. You guys with me? I'm seeing some droopy eyelids. All right? And so the first thing to show what we want to do here is if I select this bone and we step into pose mode, you have to be in pose mode. If you notice when you're in pose mode, you have a bone constraints button available here. That's where we want to go. We want to add a constraint, and the constraint we want to add is inverse kinematics. And so this chain length here, I'd like it to be about 3 links long. And so for the bones, these are the only settings we need to have. And if I want to see how that inverse kinematic is actually behaving, I can just select this bone and hit G. And I can see that it's controlling it like an arm. Of course, the collar mode is moving a little bit more if I want that chain length to be less. So 2, you can see it's just moving those 2. I think I'm going to keep it at 3 because that lets the whole thing move around a lot more. And one thing that might help you a lot as you get into this process is set up a camera and record yourself actually walking, because that might give you a better clue, because it's a far more complicated movement than you might anticipate. 1, 2, 3. G. Move that around. If you accidentally set a pose, so if I left click here and I want it to be reset to where it was, I can hit A for all, then pose, and then clear transform all. So that way all the transformations are clear. That's an important thing to keep in mind. Let's set up the feet. So I'm going to set up the inverse kinematics on these bottom leg bones here. Inverse kinematic. Oh, and before I forget, it's important that we name our bones to a certain degree. So like this bone right here, I want it to be named, this is going to be our main bone. So select it here, go to the bone properties here. And if you step into the armature up here, you can name the bones individually as well. You can see how the bones are also connected in this hierarchy. This bone is our left foot, so I'm going to name it foot.L, just so I know what that bone is. And this bone is our right foot, so I'm going to name it foot.R, right there. So it's important that you're not naming just the whole armature or the whole data object itself, but the individual bone. Again, so let's set up the inverse kinematics on this. And for the target for this one, because we need it to be a little bit different, I'm going to set it up to be the armature. We only have one armature in their scene, so it's the armature. And then the bone target that we want to use to control this inverse kinematics is our left foot. So I scroll down so I see left foot. And that's why it's important to name it. The chain length we want for this, I'm just going to start with 2. So what this should allow us to do, if everything's set up right, is to grab this guy and move this. And so if we want that length to be longer, G, let me set that up. Let's see this here, foot L, use tail length, iteration, armature, foot L. It's moving, but G, it's not moving as far as I wanted. Set this up, chain length, G. So if it's doing this, this is a good learning opportunity. What might be happening here is that the parenting might not be quite right. And so if I step back into edit mode and move this around, you see how it's disconnected here? What we need this to be is parented to this guy. So I have to change this in edit mode. So I'm going to shift right click, hit Control P, and connect it. So now we come back down here and go back to pose mode. Select that armature, foot bone is foot left, and chain length is 3. Grab this guy, G, and now we see it's moving the way we want. So you're going to encounter problems like that, and most of the problems that you might see are how things are connected or not connected. So keeping close keeping close contact with that. G. And don't panic. This is going to take multiple tries to get it right, and that's part of the process. Looks good. Then I'd like to set up the same for the head, inverse kinematics. Just set up 2 here. G. So there we have the head. So that's our basic rig, and it's a really basic rig. Normally what we do with more complex rigs is we set up controllers for everything, limits for everything, so we can't stretch things all over the place. And if you've made it this far and you haven't saved it yet, it would be a good idea to save this. So I'm going to call this Dude 3. Now, I need to connect, let's set up a floor. We haven't set up a floor yet. So over here, I'm going to step into object mode, Shift A, mesh, plane. This will be our floor. Scale up the floor. And I'd like it to have a round edge, so I'm going to add a subsurf to it. Turn that up to views 2 or 3. Let's scale that up even more, so that way it looks more like a horizon from the camera's point of view. And you can see it's going through our mesh right now. What we'd like is for that floor to be close to the feet. Now let's set up the feet so that they can't go through the floor. Go back to pose mode. Now select the feet. Go to constraints, and the constraint we're going to use is floor. And the thing we want to constrain it to is the plane. And so to test it, just grab the foot and move it up and down, and hopefully it doesn't pass through the floor, which is exactly what happens. Do the same with this guy, add constraint, floor, plane. And then to show that this is actually constraining it, if we move the floor up and down, you can see that it actually moves the feet. So, select the armature, select all the bones by hitting A, and then pose. Where are you? Clear transform all. There's no shortcut for clearing all the transforms, but you can set one up in the preferences. What I'd like to do is make sure that the floor is just touching the feet just barely for the purpose of this animation. So just about right there. Save. Everyone with me? Now, we haven't connected the armature to the mesh yet, so this part is important. So, object mode, select the mesh first, then shift right click the armature, Control P. We're going to choose automatic weights. Now, if you're making a robot or something like that, you're going to use a different system. You might connect every part of the robot to individual bones, which is doable. But if we're doing a blobby mesh like this, automatic weights is a good thing to choose. And what's going to happen is it's going to automatically connect bones to the areas that are close to the mesh. Automatic weights shouldn't take very long. To test it, step into pose mode while you have the bone selected, and then grab a bone and hit G. You can see it's all connected now. Select this bone, G, can't get through the floor, move everything around. There's no limits or anything on this armature, so he can get all cartoony and weird, and that can be kind of fun. G, can move his head around. Good. So let's set up the walking cycle. Again, keep two different views, but we want to split these views in general. So I'm going to split my, let's see here, let's move this guy up, and then split this down. Let's turn this into the dope sheet, because we're going to have to control keyframes in a big way. And we won't really need the timeline very much, so I'm going to minimize it. But the timeline's important to keep open, because it has our play buttons and stop buttons. Though, you can always hit Alt-A, and it'll start playing. Also, I only want this to be about 40 frames long. For this animation, each step is going to be about 10 frames. Because if you time out your animations, if you time yourself walking, each step is about 1/3 of a second if you're walking at a quick pace. But if you wanted to go slower, you could. So I'm going to make the end of the animation 40 frames. So let's start posing this guy. What we want to do is have, if it's a perfect loop, what is the prerequisite for a perfect loop? Starting in the same place, exactly. So that's the key concept here. So we got to make a pose that is the end and start of it. So we're going to have a pose where his legs are spread out. So let's start posing him. And there's a few ways you can go about this, but I'm just going to try it this way. So move this leg out here, this leg out here. And this isn't going to be a very realistic walk, because if you were to model a foot, like a humanoid foot, the actual steps of the foot walking up and stepping up are really complex. That's why I'm just doing this blobby guy, so we can just get something that's very basic, but still have a convincing animation where it looks like he's propelling himself. And so the arms here, and if you make a character that doesn't have arms, that would be kind of funny and cool. I just saw a really fantastic exhibition, and I think it's still up at Hall Walls by Layla Ali. She gave a really good art talk as well over the weekend, and she has some really fascinating characters that she paints, and I thought, oh, this would be fun to animate into cartoons. But that's where I look for inspiration and things like that. So we got his legs spread out right there. And then normally when someone's walking, they might be leaning a little bit towards the step that they're leaning towards. So I'm going to select the main bone here and hit R, so he leans a little bit forward and move him over a little bit like that. Notice we can make him go do a little dance. And maybe his head will be bobbed down a little bit. So let's select his head and hit R, make that move down, maybe roll him a little bit forward as well. It's kind of dumpy here. R, there we go. So notice I'm selecting that main bone that I set up as sort of the root of the core of the body, and it controls the directions of the arms and the head. So there's a good sort of pose. It's simple. And so if I like where everything is there, I'm going to select all the bones. I hit A to deselect all, A to select all. And then I'm going to hit I, and lock rot. So location and rotation of all the bones. So now we see all the bones here and a keyframe for all the bones. They're yellow when they're all selected. What I'd like to do is duplicate those frames to frame 40. And you could go to frame 20 if you wanted to make it, I'm going to give it a little bit more space. I'm going to hit Shift D, duplicate all those frames to frame 40. And when there's an orange line between keyframes, I think it's counterintuitive, but what it means is nothing is changing. If there's no orange line between keyframes, then that means there's animation there. So what we want to do next is set up the counterpose to this. So I'm going to go to frame 20 and make everything opposite. Now, to make a perfect loop animation, you could compel him to move forward, and you could use the main bone to do that. But I want a looping animation. So I'm not actually going to move him, but I'm going to create the illusion that he's walking. And to change everything here, I could set up different and keyframe everything, but I'm going to do something that's somewhat dangerous. I'm going to turn on auto keyframing, that little button down there. So what happens then is every change I make, even property changes I make, a keyframe is created for it. Wake up, Dylan. You don't want to miss this. It's awesome, even though I'm recording it. So then I'm going to start moving his feet and everything to the counterpose. So I'm just going to slide his foot over here to the opposite position, move this foot over here to the opposite position. And if you wanted everything to be in a slightly different pose, that's okay. Let's grab his main bone over here, G, move him over into this position. Maybe even we can rotate him a little bit. R, Z, have him rotate towards this pose a little bit. And then we also want to change his arms. So let's move this over. Maybe rotate that a little bit. Notice the x-axis, so if I hit RX, we can put his arm back in that position. G. And then let's move this arm over as well. RX, G. Notice keyframes are being created as I make these changes, and those orange lines are disappearing. And for this counterpose, maybe his head is bobbed in a different way. So maybe let's have R, and then G. Let's move that arm head over a little bit, and maybe, but his head is still going in that sort of direction there. R. So now we have the two poses, and if I start scrubbing between them, we see he's got a sort of a walk there, but it looks like he's ice skating. So what we have to do is actually pick up his feet, or her. And so I still have auto keyframe turned on. I wish there was a big red light on the screen when that's turned on, because if you don't turn that off and you change things, it can really mess you up. After Effects has this, and all the animated programs have a similar auto keyframing function. You just want to be aware when it's on. So let's have him step up a foot. So which foot in this section here is moving forward? Because the foot that's on the ground would be the foot pushing, and it'll stay on the ground during that movement. This foot is resetting and moving forward, so that foot's the foot's going to come up. So on this frame here, let's just move it up a little bit, and notice now it steps up. And then let's come over here, and what it does is it slowly puts it down. I think I don't want him to step down until right before he actually hits the ground, so let's move this up here. So you see this foot coming up and then coming down. If you want it to come up a little bit higher in the middle, you can move it up. If you wanted it to move over a little bit further, you could. There we go. Let's do the same over here for this foot's reset. Select it here, up, come over here, up, and then in the center, maybe a little bit higher. If this were a real foot and you had a whole foot shape there, you might be controlling its rotation and everything to make that movement look a little bit more succinct. Let's scrub back and forth and see what that looks like now. I can hit Alt-A for a shortcut to play. It's starting to come together. What I'd like to do now is add a little bit more bobbing because I think if the legs were spread out like this, he would move up and down. When someone walks, they move up and down. So let's select that main area right here. And I've got auto keyframing turned on, so I don't have to set keyframes. Let's select main, have him come up a little bit at each peak. Let's see how that goes. There we go. So at its most basic, this is what we're doing. You can just make small changes like this and you tweak it so that way you get a walking motion. And then we could add other things, like if we wanted to add appendages, ears, and things like that, we could have those shaking for secondary animations as we move forward. To get a clearer idea of how this is looking, let's split this view over here. I'm going to hit in. Let's turn on, sometimes it's nice when you're animating to turn on, where is it? Metcap. You get a more of a clay type of 3D port view. And then you can turn on ambient occlusion or whatever. You might get a little bit more contrast. But one thing I like to do is I come over to display and I turn on only render and I hit A. So that way all the little screen shortcuts and everything are turned off and you only see your mesh. Let's select the mesh right here again, and then let's hit T. Let's turn on smooth shading so it looks a little bit more blobby. And then after I've got the basic animation built and everything and I'm happy with it, I can start worrying about the textures, adding eyes and so forth. And in another lesson, I'll show you how to add eyes to this guy and have those eyes look around but still be actually connected to the head. Does this make sense? It's really, really simple, but it builds upon a lot of the things that we're learning, and the basic animation techniques are something that I'm trying to get across. So you'll set up a camera. The camera will be looking at him about so forth here, and then you'll just loop that. And if you wanted to duplicate the frame, so that way you wanted to add in some background or anything, make it look like he's walking past stuff, then all we need to do here is start duplicating frames, keyframes. And then we could add variations to the animation after the basic walking cycle is made. So if I zoom out a little bit, hit A to deselect all the keyframes, B for box select, select these keyframes here, and then hit Shift D, I'll move these over. So I'm not duplicating the first keyframe because that's right here, remember. Then I can hit Shift D again, move that over here, and I can change the speed of each one individually, but now it looks like I'm ending on frame 124, so I can make the movie end at frame 124, rather 124, and then I can add all sorts of other animations throughout the midst of all of this. So now if I hit Alt-A, so I've got that looping animation now, and it loops perfectly back to frame 1, but then I can add some variation. Maybe at the peak point here, maybe he's going to start doing some things like maybe bobbing his head a lot more. So let's turn off only render. Let's select this keyframe. I've still got auto keyframe turned on, so keep in mind it's dangerous. And then I hit R, and then move his head over, and then maybe R here for rotate, move his head over and move his whole body over a lot more. Then come over here to this top frame, and let's have his whole body move over here. So I'm just varying the cycle. So you don't have to just make one step and then another step and then in the movie. You can make a longer looping cycle where there's a lot more variation in it. And that would make it a lot more interesting. So you can add, remember the appeal aspect of the 12 principles of animation, you can add an appeal to this by just varying the animation a little bit. And sometimes the thing that adds to the liveness of this is to not have all the keyframes be in single rows, but to rather change things at odd or other keyframes. So I'm moving, if I hit R over here, let's see what happens. So there's more of a bob there on that step. His head moved up. Now, it was a little bit of a jerk, so I didn't like how that moved. Right there, it's a little bit too fast. And I can see that's happening right there. So that's that keyframe. And if I look closely at the dope sheet, this keyframe right here is the main keyframe, main bone. If I don't like it, I can just hit X and get rid of it. Now that doesn't happen anymore. Cool? We can do this. We're gonna have fun doing this. So now that I've built the basic animation, I've got a rig, this is a good experiment. Then I can add textures, I can make all sort of fun things with my object, I can add physical simulations, I can add stuff in the background. Everything has to loop though. So if he's walking past things, Kelly, you could have him walking past Kmart. She did a good Kmart project in the other class, it was really funny. Or he could be walking through Kmart or something like that, it might be really interesting. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and I think it could be fun. Cool beans.